Hello, my friends, and welcome back to another episode of Radical Radio Scotland. Now, I do apologise about the unexpected delay in the episodes coming out, but thankfully we're back on track and we're ready to hear from some more activists in Scotland. Today we are joined by the fantastic Sarah Ní Dochartaigh. So, you know the drill. Everybody, please put your hands together for Sarah. Sarah, thank you so much for coming on Radical Radio Scotland.
No worries, thanks for having me.
Especially since it's a lovely day outside. Is it lovely where you are?
Yeah, it's really nice here.
Yeah, I appreciate it. So could you tell us a bit about how you got interested in environmental politics?
Yeah, so I guess like I grew up in rural Ireland, so it was kind of quite close to nature, but like in Ireland, like agriculture is so intensified. So while I grew up quite close to nature, I was also quite close to a lot of environmental degradation. So that really spurred an interest in the like natural world and everything. Then I went to uni and I studied environmental science, but I think I grew a bit disillusioned with it because I saw my like lectures and everyone around me and they were doing such amazing research in science, but none of it was really being translated to policy, and that's where I saw a huge issue. And around the same time, I started to get involved in climate organizing and then later on in left-wing politics more generally. So yeah, I was in uni around the kind of summer and autumn of 2019, which I view as being a really pivotal time in the climate movement. It was around the time of the release of the really big IPCC report, the big 1.5 degrees in 10 years report. And it was also a time of growth for Extinction Rebellion and Fridays for Future. So yeah, that kind of setting really spurred an interest in environmental politics for me. And then, yeah, I moved over to Edinburgh to start studying that in a bit more depth. So yeah, here I am.
And you were saying earlier that since you've been here, you've been involved in a few climate projects. Could you tell us a bit about them?
Yeah, I haven't had the time to get as involved as I'd like, I think, but I've been involved in Climate Camp Scotland for a few months now. And yeah, generally, like most of the time I've been here, I've just been kind of learning about like the environmental scene here and the political scene more generally. And I didn't have the time to get involved in planning around COP26, unfortunately, because I'd only been here for about a month at that stage. But yeah, I'm really excited to get a bit more involved.
Yeah, that does. You were saying actually there, sorry, that you were involved with Climate Camp Scotland. I've reached out to them to try and get them on the podcast because their project looks cool, but I don't know too much about the project. Could you tell us a bit about what actually Climate Camp Scotland is?
Yeah, so climate camps are like, they used to be quite a big thing a few years ago, especially around Europe, where basically a group of activists and organizers would gather in a certain site and perform direct action around a big center of fossil fuel infrastructure. And I think it was a big thing in Scotland about 10 years ago or so, or a bit more now. And then it kind of fell off a little bit. And then Climate Camp Scotland was set up in 2019. But it was kind of halted a bit with COVID and everything. But last summer they had a big camp in Mossmoran, around the plant in Mossmoran, protesting there. And yeah, now we're organizing for something bigger this summer and we're still deciding on targets and everything. But yeah, definitely keep watching.
Yeah.
See what happens. Yeah.
Oh, that sounds well interesting. I'd love to delve more into the different options that they've came up with and stuff like that to hear who basically these like climate criminals are in Scotland.
Yeah, definitely, especially like moving over here, like I didn't know a lot about like any of the big polluters in Scotland or anything, so it's been kind of shocking to learn just the extent of it here.
Yeah. Well, you were saying that you were like you grew up in rural Ireland. It's very similar here in rural Scotland, the kind of issues. I mean, I think so anyway. You were saying you grew up in rural Ireland, and I feel like the issues in rural Scotland might be pretty similar, considering the just the geographical similarities seem to be apparent Have you was Ireland not supposed to be like extremely wooded, and it's just kind of it's barren?
Yeah, it's really not wooded at all now. So like Irish forestry like 800 years ago was like I think 80% covered in forestry,
Wow.
but that declined to colonialism and everything. And it hit a low point around the 1920s where I think only about less than 2% of the land was actually forested.
Wow.
Now it's back up to around 11%, but the vast majority of that is actually like non-native plantations, which are for the timber industry, basically, where trees are grown for about 30 years, clear felled, all cut down, and then produced into timber and sold. So
Is
while
that
the official
Sitka
forestry
spruce?
figures, it is Sitka spruce, yeah.
Yeah.
And so like official forestry figures in Ireland are about 11%, but only about 2% of that is actually like native woodland.
Yeah.
So you can really consider Irish forestry to be a lot lower than the official figures because it's essentially, most of it is essentially plantation.
Yeah. That is similar here as well. I think Scotland only had 2% of its native woodland, ancient woodland, that they call it here.
Yeah, it's really sad, yeah, once you think about everything that was lost, yeah.
It is really sad. I feel like Scotland in particular is just viewed as this pure, beautiful country, and like all of these scenic mountain ranges are touted as being world class and so on. But the reality is they're like ecological deserts. There's nothing going on there. There's no biodiversity. It's
Yeah,
just
completely.
grass.
In environmental like science and psychology, there's this idea of like a shifting baseline syndrome where every generation has basically a lower expectation for what like nature should be. So we view these like agricultural pastures, or like you said, the Scottish like mountains being complete wastelands. We view that as being like nature, really, because that's what we expect nature to look like. Whereas it's actually a lot different. It's a lot wilder than just a barren stretch of land.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. I want to move on to the IPCC report that's just been published because, I mean, I don't know if you have to read it all because you're studying environmental science and stuff like that, but there's no chance that I'm reading that many pages. So could you tell us a bit about it?
Yeah, all 3,000 pages of it. No, I haven't read all. I've read the summary and some chapters in a bit more depth, but
Yeah,
basically the essence of it is that it's not too late to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, but it will take an absolute Trojan effort and emissions have to peak pretty much immediately. So there's three sections of the IPCC. The first focuses on physical science. The second, released a few weeks ago, focuses on adaptation. And this is the report that focuses on how we mitigate climate change. And it really hammered home the fact that we have the solutions to actually limit warming to about 1.5 degrees. But the barrier is through political action. The solutions just aren't being implemented in policy. And what was really interesting about this report is that for the first time I had a whole chapter dedicated to the social barriers to mitigation. And this was chapter 5 of the report. And it basically said that lifestyle changes en masse can have a significant effect, but it must be backed up by policy. So, and a lot of these policy options, they could have a really good impact on well-being as well. So, for example, in transport, like prioritizing alternative modes of transport and mobility are one of the main ways in reducing demand. And, obviously it requires people to actually take public transport, but it requires a lot of policy to actually make that possible for people. And so this is through like cheap and what I believe should be free public transport, and also making it more accessible and widespread. It can also massively reduce heating bills through stuff like mass retrofit schemes, which obviously massively reduce household emissions, but also reduce heating bills, which is really critical right now given the fuel price increases. One thing which was also quite interesting about it was there was a lot of like degrowth narratives embedded in it. So it spoke about like adaptation of low demand energy practices in like work and consumption. And it spoke about kind of changing our work practices a lot, which to me is kind of congruent with like a 4-day working week, which is a big degrowth selling point. Yeah, and it also spoke a lot about switching development from GDP growth to focusing on like actually meeting people's basic needs and coming up with like an economic threshold for well-being. Because like wealthy households consume a lot more than what is needed for a decent living standard. So it spoke a lot about, yeah, like limiting economic growth but meeting well-being, which I found really interesting because this is something the IPCC would have traditionally like shied away from. And yeah, basically said there's a lot of like social solutions that have multiple benefits in increasing well-being. But yeah, the barrier to these being implemented is political will. And yeah, I think one of the main points of it is that like we have the solutions in terms of technology and, you know, science, but they're just not being implemented in policy, which in one way it's hopeful that we have the solutions there, but I also think it's something we should be very angry about, that, you know, we have all these answers that can massively improve our future, but it's just like the one barrier is that governments aren't taking action to actually implement those. So yeah, that's the essence of it, and that's really what I took from it.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, no, you are right though. To be like, we should be angry. And although the barrier is political will, I just wanted to touch on that a bit, because it seems like throughout the whole, from the start of humanity becoming aware about the climate crisis until now, governments have known about climate change, and the fact they've not acted on it is because they're not just like allowing it to happen, but they're like actively benefiting off of it. So I was just wondering what your opinion was on like, as just trying to find the political will what is going to make the difference, or is it kind of just changing who is the one that makes these decisions a better solution? Does that make sense?
As in like changing who is in government, or,
Well, not just changing,
you know, reducing.
changing the whole structure of government. Maybe we don't
Yeah,
actually,
like
we don't require a government in this day and age to do stuff like that.
for me personally, like I believe in like a state and a government. I just think it needs to be completely uprooted and changed. Like one of the findings of the IPCC report says that deep economic and structural changes are required. And for me, that it kind of codes for like moving away from capitalism as a solution to like the climate crisis, basically. Because the way like capitalist states tend to address the climate crisis is through market measures, which fundamentally are to reproduce capitalism rather than actually addressing the climate crisis. And that's done through things like carbon markets and, you know, carbon taxes and offsetting and everything, which they're not really proven to be that effective, but they just lock us into an economic system that's based off, you know, extracting as much as we can from less wealthy countries. And all of these solutions are really working within the capitalist system and just shouldering burdens everywhere. And that's inherently what our government is, like neoliberal governments are doing. Like they're inherently trying to protect capitalism rather than the environment. But for me personally, yeah, my kind of theory of change is that the state can be a powerful tool in, you know, mitigating climate change, but it can be done through as a focal point for the redistribution of wealth. Yeah, that's where I stand on it, really.
Yeah, you're right. I do agree that, you know, some states have had a really good impact on the environment, like Cuba, for example. They've got such a really strong environmental protection, like they've got a strong history of that. So yeah, I think that we should just be kind of, well, for me personally, it comes down to power imbalances. And obviously one of the biggest power imbalances that we're talking about here is humanity over nature. But that's obviously applicable to loads of other things as well. We definitely do need to, I don't think people understand how interconnected all of these issues are, and how the struggle against climate change is also, like you say, a class struggle where we have to redistribute the wealth if we're going to be making a positive impact on climate change. So just moving on from that a bit, see the UK government has announced a new energy strategy. Have you looked into that?
Yeah, I've looked into it. I've read the report and everything. It's nowhere near as long as the IPCC report, but which made it a bit easier. But yeah, it's kind of grim as a report. It doesn't really address either the current like cost of living and fuel price crisis or the climate crisis. It basically centers around making the UK less dependent on imports, but it really sets us on a path that soars past 1.5 degrees Celsius, and it's really incompatible with our current climate goals because it kind of relies a lot on increasing oil and gas production in the North Sea. So it announces like a new round of oil and gas licensing in autumn, and it also introduces a body for fast tracking oil and gas applications in the North Sea.
That's shocking, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like
it was released around the same time as the IPCC report, and everything that the British Energy Security Strategy, which is the official name for it's really incompatible with everything said by the IPCC. So like on the IPCC report, it said that emissions have to peak before 2025, whereas the Energy Security Strategy, it's announcing new oil and gas fields, and most of those won't actually be working until past 2030. And then after that, oil and gas fields have a typical lifespan of about 20 to 40 years. So obviously it completely flies in the face of everything that was said by the IPCC scientists. And when you're talking about that length of a timescale, it really doesn't address the immediate like impacts of the fuel price crisis, because we're talking about a timescale that's decades from now, really. And also the idea of being less dependent on imports through increasing oil and gas production in the North Sea, that's really not going to reduce costs of fuel prices either, because the prices are set by a global market. So increasing production here isn't really going to reduce costs to people in the UK at all. So yeah, it's a very contradictory and strange report.
Yeah, it just doesn't make sense that the UK government would even try and hit out with things like that. What kind of what I just can't believe how they just are so open about it and somehow it doesn't get reported on. Obviously the media is like more than complicit, but I mean it was like not during COP26 that they were announcing the Campbell oil field and all that.
Yeah, it's kind of strange that they're announcing all these like new oil and gas fields around the time of big reports that really contradict everything they're saying. It's just really strange to me. But also like maybe one good point in the energy security strategy is that it kind of sidelines fracking a lot. Like it orders a review of science around fracking to see whether it's safe or not. But it doesn't explicitly say that we're going to introduce it, which is one good point. And the review of science has to prove that fracking is safe and doesn't have an impact on local communities, which fracking pretty much does. So maybe that's one good point you can take from the energy security strategy, is that it's not really very pro fracking, which
that is good because fracking is obviously a massive danger. That was the thing as well. The thing that I never understood about fracking, it's also applicable to the North Sea, is this, like you said, they say it's going to reduce.
I'm sorry, I think I've lost connection. If you can still hear me.
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Sorry, I just lost you there, I think.
That's okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Sorry, I just missed your last point.
Okay, yeah. So I was just saying, like you said, the thing about what I never understood about fracking was what the UK government are saying about the North Sea oil productions just now. as like you were saying, they said that it would reduce our dependency on foreign imports. But that's just not the case. It's like none of these companies that are extracting oil are nationalized. None of them are owned by the UK government. So you're not protecting your own. Like that oil belongs to that government that's then exporting it to an international market.
Exactly. I mean, like over the past year, Shell made profits of something around 14 billion, whereas obviously households in the UK now are facing massive increases in gas prices.
I just kind of wanted to add to that as well. Like you said, Shell reported these record profits, but apparently it's a fuel crisis. There's a big crisis going on, but it's obviously not that. It's just greed. Like all of these companies across various industries are reporting record profits.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, one of the biggest proponents for fracking in the UK is Jim Ratcliffe, who owns Ineos, and he's like one of the wealthiest people in the UK. He's moved to Monaco to avoid paying something like 4 billion in taxes. And now he's promoting fracking to address the cost of living crisis and fuel poverty in the UK. And that extraction is going to, the money generated from that extraction is going to go directly to the hands of corporations, to massive fossil fuel corporations, not going, and it's not going to lower the bills of anyone in the UK. So it's really disgusting that, you know, companies like Shell, like Ineos, are using narratives that really, they're using something that has such a terrible effect on so many people to justify their need to extract oil and to increase their own profits. So yeah, it's really, really disgusting.
Disgusting is one way to put it. I honestly don't know how they get away with it. But I mean, they don't always get away with it. I remember reading something about what happened between Shell and Nigeria in the 90s, man. That was horrible. But they ended up having to pay out a massive amount of money. But I do want to talk about it. It's horrible. But you were saying that it is good that the UK energy report didn't really mention fracking. It kind of just sidelined it and said that they want an investigation of science into it, whatever that means. What do you think the next steps are in regards to fracking in the UK? Do you not think it's even a possibility that the UK government will try and approve it?
Well, I know Jim Ratcliffe of Ineos, he's really pushing to loosen restrictions around fracking, and I think he has a test site in Nottinghamshire. But I think it's quite well known the impact that fracking has on local communities. Like it results in so much water and air contamination. And on a wider scale, there's so many methane leakages linked to fracking, which obviously has a huge impact on greenhouse gas emissions. But yeah, I really don't know what way fracking is going to go in the UK. But yeah, I think one thing that's also important to note is that while fracking obviously isn't a thing in the UK right now, Scotland still supports fracking through the importation of fracking to Ineos in Grangemouth. And that comes from Pennsylvania and the US, where, you know, local communities have been so strongly affected by fracking. And I think that's something that's important to note too around fracking discourses, that we're not doing it right here, but we're still supporting it. And I think that's something anti-fracking campaigners in the UK and, you know, environmental activists more generally need to focus on a bit, because like, yeah, it's such a global thing, and fracking is something that has such a huge impact on local communities. And yeah, I think it's important to note that while we stand against fracking here, it is quite hypocritical to support it through importing fracked gas.
Yeah, no, you're definitely right. You're definitely right. That was actually something that people did campaign against, but it obviously just got lost in the noise because you never hear about that anymore, which is mad because, like you say, it is such a global thing. And if we don't really take a stand against that, then it's just essentially NIMBYism, isn't it? Just not in my backyard. Like,
yeah, definitely.
Like you can't put your big drills up here, but we'll happily use it whilst you've done it elsewhere. That is
Yeah, and
something
I
that
mean,
needs to be addressed.
Yeah, and it was a thing in Ireland as well, where we banned fracking in Ireland a few years ago, but there's still plans to import fracked gas from the US, from Appalachia, which is a really an area that's so strongly impacted by fracking. Um, so yeah, it's something that's quite hypocritical, but it's, yeah, like you said, it's complete NIMBYism. And it's the idea that, like, if you can't physically see the impacts of fracking in a country, like, you're less likely to be aware of how bad it can be.
Yeah. I think learning about what fracking had done to Pennsylvania was what was like the first kind of experience that I had with fracking. I remember reading about that like just after the Scottish independence referendum in 2014 and just getting interested in that. And that's how me and my pals, we ended up starting up the Don't Frack the Briggs, like a
Mhm.
localized anti-fracking group. That was so mad. That's why I was saying earlier, I don't know if it actually came through, but I was saying that INEOS are really unprofessional because not only are they like union busting and just really daft that way, but in my experience, at least when we had that loads of localized campaigns in different towns and villages across the central belt where they wanted to frack, INEOS like completely crumbled, gave them the runaround. I couldn't believe how easy it was to get under their skin. So for example, we had a public meeting and we had like it was fully packed, over like 350 people there. There's people standing down the side and all the seats were taken, stuff like that. And we had a panel of like different politicians and anti-fracking campaigners, and then we invited along the INEOS, like someone from INEOS to give their side. And obviously everyone there was against fracking. We'd already built up this kind of foundational opposition to it. And the guy just got slaughtered in that meeting from the general public. Like we didn't even have to do anything. But after that, they thought it's a good idea having public meetings. So they announced a tour of all the all the towns that they'd been and had the same thing happen to. And for some reason, they put all the tickets online. So we would just like book out all the tickets. So like nobody could go. And I was so struck with how easy it was to wind up this massive, massive company. They've got like over £1 billion in revenue or something.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, that's wild.
Yeah, but I
But
mean, if that's the people, if that's the like, if that's what the people who are ruining the environment are doing, then surely we can outsmart them and stop them from doing this.
exactly. Here's hoping anyway. Yeah, I know like one of the big quotes from Jim Ratcliffe recently was that he wants to emulate a fracking boom in the UK like they just had in the US, which it's a terrible narrative to have because I mean around off last year they had their fracking boom over the past 10 years or so, and it had terrible impacts on the local community. Like it completely polluted water and air. I think there was about 10,000 deaths announced that were linked to fracking. And as well as that, the main narrative that INEOS are using to promote fracking is that it could be like a really good source of jobs. Whereas in Appalachia, communities that had fracking in their area, they didn't really report any increase in jobs at all. So it's interesting that a company like that, with so much obviously access to like resources and research, would come out with statements like that are just totally nonsensical. Um, yeah,
Yeah.
it's a bit mad.
Well, that was what like at that public meeting that we had, their guy gave his presentation, and then after him was Patrick Harvey of the Scottish Green Party, who was speaking after them. And when he stood up, like the whole, this is how you knew everyone was anti-fracking because he got like a standing ovation from everybody there, and he was like, "I've not even said a word yet," so he just got like this massive support. But he was saying in that INEOS presentation that they gave to our town, they said that they had great experience in the technology and they had like all of this proof of record of how safe it's been and how safe they've operated it. But also they said that it was a new technology, a new science, so that they like by doing it we would be at the front of it. And after that presentation, Patrick Harvey went and he was like, you can't have a long-standing history of performing it safely and it being new. Like you have to choose one. I feel like they've always had hypocritical and daft statements like that. I mean, I don't know how they actually get away with it, considering how daft they are. But that meeting, yeah, they just got slaughtered. But I mean, even the stuff as well with like Ineos trying to union bust.
Yeah, that was crazy. The like whole shutting down the plant or threatening to shut down the plant at least once workers tried to unionize.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like you're just trying to make yourself out to be the bad guy, really. I don't even know what they're trying to do.
Yeah. So you were saying earlier that you're from rural Ireland. This was something that I wanted to know about. So how responsible would you say is British colonialism for the kind of degradation of Ireland's environment?
Yeah, so obviously since colonialism, various governments in Ireland have been really really complicit in the degradation of Ireland's environment. But a lot of the kind of long-lasting effects of colonialism are still apparent in Irish biodiversity. So yeah, like I was saying earlier, one of the primary examples of that is through Irish forestry, where Ireland was a really richly forested country, but with colonialism, a lot of that was clear-felled and used in British manufacturing and construction. There's stories of timber from Limerick in Ireland being used to construct Westminster Abbey. And it was used a lot in industries that were instrumental to helping to create British wealth. And yeah, that's had a really long lasting effect in Irish policy. And even now in, say, in forestry policy, one of the primary narratives of like Irish forestry at the moment is kind of geared towards profit. And there still is that very colonialist, capitalist notion of nature being a commodity. And I think that's something that's really, it's apparent in like all kind of colonized countries, that nature is viewed as something that can be extracted for the purposes of wealth creation. And yeah, I think obviously colonialism, environmental degradation, are really interlinked, and they're both kind of rooted in the idea that both people and the environment are kind of something that can be taken over, that can be commodified. Yeah, and even like in Ireland, the legacies of that are still very apparent, just through capitalism being like one of the main legacies of colonialism. And even today, just talking about colonialism more broadly, like a lot of fossil fuel projects are based in Indigenous land, particularly in like Canada and in Australia. And yeah, I think as such, like environmental movements really need to be explicitly anti-colonialism in their narratives and in everything they do. And we need to like integrate calls for reparations into our demands and ensure that like, you know, solutions to the climate crisis aren't colonialist, like what happened in the US, like during the formation of the national parks and everything. They have quite a colonial legacy. So they're primarily created for the preservation of nature, but from a very aesthetic point of view.
So I think Ireland was part of the Celtic Rainforest, is that right?
So natively we have what's called like a temperate Atlantic rainforest,
Yeah.
which there's like only like very few places like that are restored to that or that are still intact. But they're actually so beautiful. But they're so rare to see. Like even I've only seen like photos of those in recent years, because like usually in Ireland what a forest is like plantations of citrus spruce, and it's really like not related to like actual nature at all. And like I remember when I was studying in environmental science, like we used to do biodiversity surveys of different areas of forestry and different types of forestry. And when you're studying like a citrus spruce plantation, like you have to record all the species in the area. And like with a native forest, you have like saplings of different trees coming through. You have, you know, different levels of growth. You have ferns, you know, different like smaller low-lying plants. But like in a citrus spruce plantation, you have like siccus spruce, bare ground, and maybe a bit of moss if you're lucky.
Hmm.
So yeah, the actual disparity between like what's kind of recorded as forest in official records in Ireland and like what is actually like nature and what is like proper biodiverse woodland, it's very different.
Yeah, it's similar in Scotland as well. Like it's just plantations everywhere, and it's just a complete monoculture. Like nothing actually lives there.
Yeah, completely. Even like I don't know about Scotland, but in Ireland, the emergence of siccus spruce plantations has actually been linked to like the decline of a lot of bird species and the extinction of several of them.
Wow.
So it's interesting that something like forestry, which you automatically assume is good for the environment, can actually have a devastating effect if it's done wrong.
Yeah, I think how we tell apart in Scotland, at least, that what was part of that rainforest, that uh, North Atlantic rainforest, is just by identifying it as rainforest, you can pure tell the difference. I mean, you've got a lot of Loch Lomond. See, if you go in the islands of Loch Lomond, that is just basically what this whole part of Scotland would have been like on the west coast, at least. And I'm assuming what Ireland would have been like. There's different little enclaves of Scotland's rainforest, but it's so fragmented that I don't see how it comes back.
Yeah, I think like one of the main ways of bringing it back, it's not to just like plant a forest somewhere where there was never really a forest, it's just to expand and link what's called biodiversity corridors. So like what you were saying about the fragments of different areas of forestry, it's like you basically allow those fragments to link together and expand rather than just creating a new forest, which will probably be quite unnatural for the area.
Yeah, yeah, that's the thing. Like you just have to. That's one of the problems that it's one of the sorry the kind of line of thinking that has caused these problems is that we have all the answers and we know what's best for nature, when really we don't really know that much about how an entire ecosystem functions to where we could perform it to the same level as just leaving the land to do what it does best.
Yeah, completely. Like there's some really cool restoration projects in Ireland where the people involved in them, they didn't really do a lot themselves, as in they didn't go and like plant trees or anything in the area. They just kind of fenced off an area near woodland and just like let the woodland naturally expand. And that's had really good results. And yeah, I think, yeah, like what you were saying about the idea that we can go and create nature because we know what nature is, it's not really true. You just kind of have to let it be and let nature grow and take its own course and stop viewing it as something that we can create as humans.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's one of the projects that I'm involved with just now. We only set it up last year, but at the north of Glasgow, there's a big range of hills called the Campsie Fells, and like if most of Glasgow, wherever you are, you can see them. Well, a lot of Glasgow, you can see them, and I live just near the base of these hills, and just like seeing them all the time, I remember just thinking, how good would it be if just that was a left that like those whole that whole range of hills was just left to rewild itself, and then we just got a campaign going. That's what we're trying to do just now because the like you were saying, wildlife corridors and like ecological corridors, they're really important to different species. And where the hills are located geographically, it's not too far from Loch Lomond at all. So if they were allowed to wild, there could be an argument of like joining them up as well. And that would also help kind of the environment snowball back into the way that it should be. And one of the ways that we are seeing it, I don't know if you've ever paid any interest to this, but they recently reintroduced beavers into Scotland, and they're just like making their way through the central belt of Scotland from like up Perth above Edinburgh, and they're almost at Loch Lomond, so they're almost back in Scotland's rainforest. So it would be cool to see how a species like that is actually skilled way better than humans at generating little environments and habitats will do when they actually reach remnants of the like the North Atlantic rainforest.
Yeah, that's amazing. Like I always find it kind of wild that like you have to physically like reintroduce an animal that like would be here natively, that like we as humans have done so much to completely eradicate nature that we just wiped out an entire species that should be found here. So it's really cool to see, yeah, projects like that where like beavers are just like slowly making their way across Scotland. It's really cool to see. Yeah.
Yeah, it's cool. I was going to make a wee documentary about it because they'd reintroduced them, but they were also allowing farmers to shoot them or something like that. It was like something mental. Like you could get a license to kill a beaver. Like, what is the actual point in reintroducing them if that's what you're going to do? But I think they just got rid of that practice, and now it's cool to see like the maps of beavers have been spotted here, beavers have been spotted here, and then like suspected beaver range. Because I feel like for a lot of time it was like birds that were getting reintroduced to Scotland, which is obviously good. It's great to see the eagles, the sea eagles and stuff like that get reintroduced. But at the same time, you want to see like not just the coastline being affected, you want to see all of the kind of the land environment and see how that changes. But
Yeah, definitely.
like you were saying as well, a lot of this is just putting up a big fence to keep out deer. I don't know how similar it is in Ireland, but in Scotland, like the deer population has exploded mental. It's like the biggest threat to all of these enclaves of woodland.
Yeah, it's similar in Ireland. Because like obviously we used to have wolves in Ireland, but yeah, again with colonialism, they were kind of like wiped out. And they used to naturally limit the deer numbers, but like now we don't have wolves in Ireland, which it's a contentious topic in like Irish environmental politics. It's the reintroduction of wolves. But yeah, we have that similar problem of deer because of that, where yeah, populations just grow like crazy, and especially in like the Wicklow area around Dublin, it's very like mountainous. There's a lot of nature reserves there. But they're yeah, again, really highly threatened by deer populations.
Yeah, it's the same here in Scotland. It's so contentious to say that you support wolves being introduced. I think everyone wants to do that though because of that video that was made ages ago. Did you ever see that on YouTube?
No.
It was just like how wolves change rivers or something it's
Oh,
called.
in Yellowstone in the US.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, I've seen that one. It's
yeah.
really cool.
Yeah, it's really cool. And I would love to see something like that happen here. But I mean, like you say, it's so contentious to say that you support wolves being introduced. But again, the impact that they have on the environment is mental. And one of the things, like I've not really picked up that project as much as I should this year. Like I done loads on it last year, and then I just kind of got burnt out with it. But at the same time, the only reason that I've not kind of picked up again is because that whole time, my idea of how we interact with land like that has been like growing and brewing in my mind. So like we were saying, obviously nature knows best, and as long if we like hold our hands up and just let nature do what it does, it's going to regenerate. But at the same time, if we just let that happen, but we don't actually alter how we perceive society or how we interact with it, I don't really know how long that will help. I feel like this, like rewilding and stuff like that, should also be a very human-led project in terms of relearning how to interact with our environment again. Like, see, saying that all humans have a natural tendency to destroy the environment or whatever is just so untrue, because when you take indigenous groups, they've managed to live in harmony with the environment for like thousands of years. So I think rewilding isn't just letting, like taking a back seat and letting nature do the work. That's obviously a massive part of it, but I feel like we need to incorporate trying to, yeah, just rebalancing how we live with nature.
Yeah, but on like how we interact with nature, like the kind of historic way of preserving nature was to fence it off completely, like really not let any humans interact with the nature in that fenced off area. And this is still a thing in like, national parks in certain areas of Africa, where kind of people who've lived there for generations, who've lived totally like in harmony with the land, have been kind of thrown off their like ancestral lands, and not really allowed to, communities who have been like living on a certain area of land and like practicing like practices that have been totally like in harmony with nature, they're not really allowed to do that anymore. And yeah, it comes from quite a problematic idea that humans and nature are inherently, like humans are inherently damaging to nature, which obviously isn't the case. It's just the practices that we've built up here in like Europe and the kind of global north. Like that's where the issue lies. It's not a human nature thing at all.
Yeah, honestly frustrates me so much when people make that argument. Oh, it's just human nature to destroy all these things, because it's just so contrary to the evidence out there of like, it's obviously systemic. It's like it's a really Western thing.
Yeah, totally. I think we're like very much products of like the society we grew up in. And if we grew up in a society that was a lot more in tune with nature and that valued nature not as just a commodity, but as the thing that's allowed to exist in and of itself, then we wouldn't really have that idea that humans are like inherently damaging to nature. Yeah, and I think that's something I'd love to see a lot more work done in the future, is like how we as humans conceptualize the environment and how we relate to it, and how that can be improved to, not only improve our own like understanding of what nature is, but to improve the actual like physical natural world.
Yeah, I think as well that kind of comes from our society in the West, at least, views us as separate from nature instead of like being a part of it, where it's something that we come from. Like, that, yeah, it seems like people just forget that we are animals that can just communicate really, really well, and somehow the conditions that gave rise to us just don't matter.
Exactly. Yeah, like I'm quite into like evolution just like as a topic, because obviously it explains so much about like the world around us today. And yeah, everything that made humans like this more like quote unquote advanced society, it was just like purely chance, like once you get into like the actual genetic aspect of evolution. And yeah, the idea that we're inherently like above nature, that we're better than any other like animal species just because, yeah, like you said, we communicate better, it's really damaging, and it's led to a lot of problematic interactions with nature and with the natural world.
Yeah. Have you ever had a chance to, wait, I think actually you might have said this already, but did you ever have a chance to visit any of the rainforest that's left in Ireland?
I visited a few, but not as much as I'd like to. Yeah, again, they are quite difficult to like access, and yeah,
Would
they
you,
tend to be quite like, sorry.
I was going to say, do you have the right to roam in Ireland?
I'm not actually sure. I don't think it is to the same extent as it is in Scotland, but I could be wrong on that. I'm not actually sure.
Yeah. Sorry to cut you off there. I was just wondering, like, so in Scotland, you can just go there and camp and spend time there. And
Yeah,
it's,
I think in Ireland you have to ask for permission or something. But again, I'm not 100% clear on that.
yeah, that's mad. That's mad. But I think that wraps up everything that I wanted to ask you. Was there anything else that you wanted to talk about or mention?
Um, I don't I don't really think so. It's just, yeah, you kind of mentioned earlier about the kind of differences and similarities between like Scottish and Irish like left-wing politics and environmentalism in general, if you'd like to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, definitely.
Um, yeah, I guess like one thing I've kind of seen a bit of a similarity, like in Ireland, this was happening a lot before COVID, especially. And I've kind of seen it in the UK with COP, where environmental groups are kind of interacting a lot more with other movements and other organizations. And like you could see this in Scotland around COP26 when, like Fridays for Future and climate strikers, they supported the refuge workers strikes. And then in return, those like workers went and supported a COP26. And this was the thing in Ireland as well, because we were fighting against one certain trade deal, which would have had really bad impacts across like all sectors in Ireland. So like it kind of allowed us to reach out to like housing groups and labor organizations to kind of fight against this one common thing. So that's something I've kind of noticed is a similarity like between both Ireland and Scotland, and it's something I'd love to see grow a lot more in the future.
Yeah, no, me too, definitely. Like, you're right, those groups, they did really interact well during COP26. I know that Living Rent as well was supporting the cleansing workers. So you had like a tenants union, Fridays for Future, all of these environmental groups, and the cleansing workers. Yeah, it was very interesting to see these groups come together during COP26 and support each other, because that is the way it should be. It's the same struggle. It's a common enemy. It's all the same people that are driving the inequality, the power inequality that each of them face.
Yeah, completely. And I think especially like in both like Ireland and Scotland, we have a similar thing of like in Scotland fighting for an independent Scotland, and in Ireland fighting for a united Ireland. And there's a common thing that like we really don't want, independent Scotland or united Ireland under like neoliberalism, and we don't want to just like replicate the same society we have today, but just like under a different state system. And I think those connections are really important in fighting for that, in shaping like what could be a new society. And yeah, I think that's something I think is really interesting.
Yeah, I don't know what you mean. It's a neoliberal Scotland is not what we want. It's essentially what we have just now under the SNP, but like an independent one, it would just be, it doesn't change anything.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, if we want to change like to, have a united Ireland, to have an independent Scotland, we want to build a better state, not just the same, not just what we have right now.
Yeah, not just replicating what we have, but on a mini version.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think that wraps up everything. Is there
Okay,
anything you wanted to
perfect.
shout out? Where can people find you?
For me personally, like I'm on Twitter mainly. That's where I rant about everything. Yeah, that's the main one for me. And yeah, I guess obviously like keep an eye on like Climate Camp Scotland. We're gonna have some really exciting stuff coming up. And yeah, that's Sinead really, as we say in Ireland. That's it.
Yeah, buzzing. I can't wait to find out what Climate Camp Scotland are up to. Seems like a class organisation.
Anyway, thank you so much for having me here.
Well, thank you so much for coming on, Sarah.